Welcome everybody to today's podcast, or rather to today's LinkedIn Live. I am so excited today to have Tracey Benson as my guest, and we're going to be talking today about the culture imperative and how that intersects with building anti-racist cultures in schools, but also in the workplace. So Tracey, welcome. I'm so happy to have you.
Oh, thanks for having me. I really appreciate you reaching out and having me on. I really enjoy your book. It's a wonderful read, and it intersects a lot with the work that I do. So I look forward to our conversation today.
And that I'm holding Tracey's book here that he co-authored. So Tracey, I know you're coming from Charlotte, North Carolina, which is not too far from my hometown, which is Chapel Hill, North Carolina. So for those of you who are listening in, if you could go ahead and write in the comment where you're coming from. I know that we had a number of people sign up from all kinds of different places, including we had one person who registered who's coming from Nairobi, Kenya. So hopefully she's on the call. So welcome everybody. And let me share a little bit about Tracey. Tracey is the founder of the Anti-Racist Leadership Institute. He is the co-author of this fabulous book that I just held up, Unconscious Bias in Schools. He also has a consulting practice, Tracey Benson Consulting, and he is a Harvard School of Education graduate. My mom, actually, who I think is on the call, she's a graduate of the Harvard School of Education. I almost went there. I went to Brown University instead for their School of Education. But Tracey, what an incredible background you have, and I am so excited to have you as a guest. So thank you so much for being here. And it looks like that we've got people coming in here from Indiana. We've got my mom here from Bend, Oregon. Welcome, Mom. Betsy
Hi,
Warner.
Mom.
And so, again, as you're coming in, please go ahead and write in where you're coming from. So, Tracey, let's start off with your sharing a little bit about your story and how you got involved with the work that you're doing now. And in the process, if you can share a little bit more about the work that you're doing.
Right. Yeah. Well, thank you for that question. Actually, though, how I got into this work was just growing up as a Black child as a part of an integration program out of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. So I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and my mother enrolled us in a program called the 220 program, which was meant to integrate the suburban schools. So I went from going from my neighborhood school, which was predominantly Black, to a suburban school, which was predominantly white, and I was one of very few Black kids. And I remember a time in the 5th grade where one of my white friends and I, when we would play jokes on each other, where we would sneak up behind each other, tap each other on the shoulder, and shut the other person's locker. This was a game we played a lot. And so on one particular day, I was coming from art class, and I was carrying my art supplies. I was in 5th grade, and art supplies was in a 1-gallon milk jug that was the top was cut out and all of our supplies were stuffed into the top. And so I was coming out of art class and I saw my friend Alex at his locker. He didn't see me. So I snuck up behind him, tapped him on the shoulder and shut his locker. Got him really good because he didn't see it coming. So I laughed. He sort of laughs because he knows the game. But anyways, that happened and I walked on. I was continuing down the hallway. And halfway down the hallway, a teacher stops right in front of me. I didn't see him, Mr. Evans. I still remember his name. He says, "You should not have done that." Grabs my art supplies out of my hands and dumps them right in the middle of the hallway. Throws my jug down and walks off. And I'm like, whoa, like what just happened? Like I'm one of the good kids, man. Like my mom taught us, like we were very respectful. We got great grades. We really enjoyed school. And so I'd seen the bad kids, right? Which is proxy for a lot of my Black friends get treated this way. And I was like, wow, why are they acting so poorly? And they're getting treated so poorly by the white teachers. But for it to happen to me, I was totally taken off guard. So I bent down and, just quietly put all my things back, all my art supplies back into my art jug and just kept on walking down the hallway, really stunned that this happened. And I was almost at the classroom and the teacher, Mr. Evans, came up and put his arm around me and said, "You try to explain to me why he did what he did." And at that point, I just took his hand. I was like, "Oh, sorry, please don't touch me." Right. And he turns around and puts a finger in my face and says, "Do you want to start with me?" Right. And I'm like, "Whoa, start what? Like, relax, just don't call my mom. Like, I'm in trouble." So I'm like, "No, I don't want to start with you." And he walks off steaming mad. And I got to the classroom, I was like, wow, why did that happen to me? I'm one of the good kids, right? But I am one of the Black kids at the same time. And at that moment was a part of my racial awakening where I started to notice that a lot of the white kids that I would go to school with were exhibiting some of the same behaviors that Black kids were, but we're getting treated way more harshly, right? Just like I was for Mr. Evans. And so this was part of a number of racial awakenings I had throughout my K-12 experience and also throughout college and grad school about just how race functioned in the schoolhouse. And when I became a teacher and a principal, I noticed that these same patterns were continuing to happen in schools that I was leading and working in. And so when I pursued my doctorate, I studied the impacts of race and racism in the schoolhouse, the impacts on socio-emotional well-being and also academic performance. And I got the opportunity to join this project with Sarah Fireman, who I was a TA for her in a principal preparation program to write this book on, basically on anti-racism. And so being someone who had a lot of experience in this racial lens, that I knew that we really needed to address anti-racism as a part of our work as leaders in school buildings, I chose to pursue writing this book and also pursue this as a career where I work with K-12 leaders, college and university leaders, and education-based organizations, and some private organizations around how to best lead for racial equity.
So I'm really intrigued with this idea of racial awakening and just how I think this is something that we can kind of understand theoretically. And then when a very specific incident like that happens, this can be this moment of racial awakening. And I'm curious for any of the people who are listening in, if you also have had some racial awakening stories. And Tracey, I'm imagining this could happen on both sides, where there's a racial awakening. I mean, one of the racial awakenings that I had was when I lived in Ghana and I was the only white person for miles. And I stood out because of my skin color. And that was a new experience for me. I think it's kind of that benign racism, where it wasn't that people were, treated me poorly. It was just that I stood out. And I really had this racial awakening around just what that means to have, I have the privilege of not thinking about my skin color to suddenly becoming more aware of that. So if anybody else has thoughts around any racial awakenings that you've had, please share those. And Tracey, if you want to talk a little bit more about how that might happen on both sides.
Right. So there's scholars who write about racial identity development, realizing that we live in a racist society. We're not born with a race. Race is completely it's socially constructed, right? And so biologically, there's really no difference outside of the melanin in our skin and the way that our hair grows, things of that sort. But there's also culture in the way that we're raised. But in terms of a race, it's a social construct, right? But it's also very salient in terms of how we've been constructed as a country, unfortunately, right?
Mm-hmm.
We've been founded in very heavily racist ways, right? And we know that as a country from the very beginnings, from the Native American genocide that took place at the hands of the white white colonizers, right? And then that leads to years and hundreds of years of slavery on the backs of Black people, with the belief that whites are superior to Black people. And so we have this long, very ugly racialized history in our country that's based in white supremacy, not white supremacist, but white supremacy. And I want to explain what that means. It's this sort of thought that the belief that white people are superior to those of all other races, especially the Black race, and should therefore dominate society. So that has been our history for hundreds of years in this country. And so even if we count 1965 as the end to official sort of government sanctioned racism, that's still, hundreds of years of sort of oppression that's led up until 1965. And so from 1965 up to today, 2022, that's only 56 years, right? 2020, put us in 2021.
2021, yeah.
56 years. So we're living with this residual of very intense, legalized, and accepted racism in our country. And so from the time that we're young all the way up until the time we're adults, we're inundated with these residuals of this racism in our society. And we realize at some point in time that we're different than each other based on skin color. And there are two psychologists, Kenneth and Mamie Clark, who conducted the doll study, the seminal doll study about 5-year-olds who were asked to choose to play with either a Black doll and a white doll as a part of their study. And what they found is that regardless of the skin color of the child, whether it was a Black child or a white child, the children most often chose the white doll. right, as their preference. And when
Right.
they're asked to describe the characteristics of the white doll, they said it looked friendly and it looked nice and clean. But then when they're asked to describe the characteristics of the black doll, they said it looked unfriendly, mean, and dirty. So we can see from a very, very young age, we have an unconscious racial awakening that preferences whites due to the history of racism and white supremacy in our society.
So one of the things that you talk about a lot, Tracey, is this idea that people viewing themselves saying, "I'm not racist," but a big part of your work is really helping especially leaders to recognize that this is much more of a systemic issue, and that the only way it's not enough for individuals to really work on themselves and to really perceive themselves as not being racist. Instead, this really has to be more of a culture first initiative. And in fact, I love what you talk about, this idea of helping leaders in schools to build cultures of bravery. I love that. And this is where educators can work together to address racial bias together. So can you talk a little bit more about what are meaningful ways that that we can kind of bring people along in this kind of conversation to build these cultures of bravery?
Yeah, thank you for that question. That's very layered in a number of different ways. So I'll try to capture it in a short way. So what we're talking about, of course, as we talked about our history of racism in the country, is our sort of ingested racial bias. We have to understand that that exists. And what racial bias is, it's learned beliefs, attitudes, and stereotypes about a particular race that results in harmful or preferential treatment of members of that race. So when we see things in our society, such as unemployment rates that are higher for Blacks or Latinos than whites, this is not a normal phenomena. You know, when we understand that when there's racial gaps in terms of lifetime outcomes or opportunity, or in case of schools, academic achievement, we have to see these as anomalies that are directly connected to our history of racism and contemporary structural racism, right? And what structural racism is, it's the normalization and legitimization of an array of dynamics, historical, cultural, institutional, and interpersonal, that routinely advantage whites are producing cumulative and chronic adverse outcomes for people of color. Okay, and this is infected every one of our institutions in society because of our long history of racism in our society, where these institutions were built during a time where racism was accepted, was a way of being, right?
Right.
And so,
And if I can just intervene really quickly, I mean, if we look, for example, two boys who are best friends, one is white and one is black, even though they may have been born in the same hospital, even though they may be going to the same school, even though they may only live 2 miles apart, because of these systems that are in place, predictably, the white boy's life expectancy is as high as 25 years higher than his black friend.
right, right. And there's several studies that, sort of the everyday experience of racism in society. Two particular studies that stand out to me is the first one is a study that was conducted out of the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill about the propensity for police officers to stop motorists on the highway at day versus at night. And what these researchers found a number of times was that during the day, there was definitely a racial bias among the police officers, that they were more often to stop, ticket, and search the cars of black and brown motorists. But at night, when you can't see the race of the motorist, the statistics were the same, right? There was no difference. And so racial bias was definitely at play, and race has something to do with this. And the second study was a study that came out of Chicago, and I think this is a more popular study about employers and how they review resumes. And so what these very smart researchers did is what they did was they developed these fictitious resumes and applied for jobs. And these were identical resumes, identical experience, identical in every way, but only thing they changed was the name and the race of the applicant. Right, and what they found was that if the applicant was somebody who was identifiable as a person of color, that they were 50% less likely to receive a call back for an interview. And so these are lifetime experiences for people of color, which may result in less levels of life expectancy, because this is the chronic adverse effects of being a person of color in this society.
An analogy that I like to use a lot, which kind of in some ways captures some of this research, but in kind of very user-friendly terms, which is the analogy of two escalators. So there's an up escalator and there's a down escalator. And so some people are lucky enough to be on the up escalator. So even if they stop with the individual effort, they're still going up because there are systems in play that are going to keep them accelerating. Whereas others are on the down escalator, and sure, you can still go up the down escalator, but if you stop for even a moment, then you're going down. And so this is kind of, if looking at issues around how do we build anti-racist cultures, it's not enough for us to just give those individuals who are on the down escalator a better set of running shoes. Instead, what if we actually change the direction of the escalator so that everybody is on an escalator instead of just a few groups?
Right, right. And we often think about, changing the direction of the escalator or changing the culture and the ways in which we function as a society as like this very huge effort that, oh my gosh, it's beyond my influence, right? And I love what you write in the book about you must operate within your circle of influence. Like, what is the way in which I can affect the culture within my organization or the culture within my, sort of local community in ways in which that would be tangibly anti-racist, right? And the first part, of course, as you say, a culture of bravery is just to acknowledge that racism exists.
Yeah.
That it's a thing, right? And
I
learn about what.
I think that's really important, just that acknowledgement first, and that it's bigger than the individual. It's bigger than individuals saying, I'm not racist. Rather, there are systems in place. And so how do we start to acknowledge that this unconscious racial bias is in place? And then how do we start to tackle those systems? So tell us more about how we tackle those systems.
Right. And so there has to be sort of the adaptive mindset thing about learning about what it is. What is racism? What is racial bias? What is white supremacy? How does it affect folks within my circle of influence? How does it play out in my workplace? Right. And often organizations that I work with are on this sort of path to become more diverse, right? So this is a copy more diverse and equitable, which often means adding more people of color to the organization, right? But we have to understand first, like, why is the organization predominantly white in the first place, right? If the surrounding community is a highly diverse community, but yet your organization is predominantly white, that's because there's been an air of white supremacy within the space, right? That values white knowledge, ways, culture, and ways of being over the ways and beings and ways of knowing people of color. So that the organization often don't see the value of hiring folks of color as bringing a different skill set and perspective to the organization, and they feel more compelled to and comfortable with hiring other white people who are like them, which is a sort of a semi-natural phenomenon. We want to hire people like ourselves, but also it's attached to our long history of racism that prefaces white folks. And so we have to understand within organizations that if there's a culture that has led to either not hiring of Black or brown folks, or when Black or brown folks come in, they don't make it very long within the organization, that means white supremacy and racism is inexistent within the organization, but not intentionally. Right. So this is the idea behind, I'm the best. I'm not a racist. I have Black friends that I don't say bad and harmful things to people. So hence I'm not a racist. So racism is not just conscious. It's also subconscious, right? In terms of the way in which we preference different races, and it often influences where we live, right? Race is definitely a huge factor where we live. Often where we send our kids to school, race is often very much at play there, and also where we work and who we work with. And so these are all dynamics which race is a part of, and we have to understand our complicity in racism and accept that it exists, and we've ingested this racial bias, and that it is our duty to prompt our racial awakening, especially if we want to engage in things that aren't complicit with the way in which society has typically functioned. And if we want to diversify our organization, we have to then suss out how white supremacy has a play in the organization, and then talk about how to best create space where folks of color feel valued, feel like they have they have influence, and also are not being compelled to buy into the culture of white supremacy within the organization.
Yeah, I love that idea of creating space so that everyone feels valued and everyone feels like that they have influence. And it's not enough to just have a more diverse workforce. in face, but it really means that everybody gets to be part of the conversation. Everybody is equally valued in that. So I know we've got a number of leaders who are on this call, including Scott McGowan, who is the CEO of McGowan Brabender, which is in outside of it's in Dayton, Ohio. An amazing culture. I've gotten to visit it before. And so can we dig in a little bit more around what leaders can do? And I know that this is where your work really centers in, is specifically working with school leaders, but we can translate that to leaders in any kind of an organization. What can leaders do beyond recognizing the issue at hand and how it's more systemic and it goes beyond just individuals to really create that space that you talk about?
Well, the first thing leaders can do is keep a pulse on the racial climate of their organization, right? Race and gender as well, because gender is also at play, in terms of what way folks are experience the workplace. So the dynamics of race and gender. So what we administer when I work with private organizations or with school districts is a racial climate survey, right? That has individuals. It's a basic survey about workplace wellness. Do I enjoy coming to school, or in case of an organization, do I enjoy coming to work? I feel like my voice is heard and I'm valued. I feel like that the promotions are available to me, and that I have a straight line to sort of either vie for promotions, or I feel that it's a fair and equitable environment. So very, very innocuous question that you can ask anyone, but the precursor to administering the survey is that we have folks identify by their race and gender. So then we can disaggregate the data, and then we compare the answers across data and gender lines. And so this is what leaders can do, and to recognize that race and gender are at play within an organization, and to have a beat on the pulse of the organization predictably, right? In a way that we're going to administer this survey every 6 months, right? So I've had organizations, we're going to administer it once, we're going to make some interventions, and that's it. I mean, that doesn't do enough, right? We can all do interventions that make folks feel good for the moment, but what leaders can do is, the first thing is to administer a survey about workplace wellness with the indicators of race and gender on there, and then have to be something that's either annual or biannual, and then have working groups in terms of folks who are directly affected by the negative workplace culture involved in changing the culture of the organization. And I've seen this process work wonders for a lot of organizations that previously had a lot of blind spots, and we're spending a lot of time, money, and energy on sort of coverall strategies that weren't working. And some of the things that you write about in your book about well-meaning CEOs that are not making the right moves within their organization, and then their interventions aren't taken in the right way, and they create a more toxic work culture. So administering a survey, disaggregating the results, and then also including those who are on the receiving end of sort of the not so positive workplace, and having them help develop the solutions for people like themselves.
Interesting. So I'm curious for the listeners, if there are any things that you've done in your organization to really start to tackle this issue. So I'm hearing the importance of really, first of all, getting a baseline, and not getting that baseline just once, but repeating that to see what kind of change is happening over time. And then this idea of creating these working groups to start to change the culture, so that it really does become a more inclusive culture. Now, I know that you've worked with over 30 school districts, and in some cases you'll have a school district that will say, okay, we want a one and done. We want to feel good about this. We want to do that survey. We want to do that one-time talk, and then we're done. And we've kind of done our piece. And then there are others that have really gone deep and have really made a difference. So can you share what that has looked like in those cases where it really has worked?
Yeah, what I've noticed, I mean, and this is something that's a plague in education. I wrote an article on it. It's called The Plague of Performative Anti-Racism, right? That these one and done workshops, or these one and done modules, or these keynote speeches where someone who does this type of work, that there's an expectation, just because I talk at you for like a 90-minute keynote, somehow it's going to, light bulb's going to go off in your head, and you're going to know better, hence you're going to do better. That's typically not the way organizations function, right? There needs to be sustained attention to sort of persistent issues that exist within the organization. And so what we do in our Anti-Racist Leadership Institute is that we have our leaders with us for 4 months, right? Because it takes a while to change a culture of an organization in terms of tangible practice, but also in terms of like the adaptive ways and the ways in which people think about the diversity or equity in a way that's more tangible, that has actually tangible outcomes on students and on individuals who work in the organization. And so what I've seen work the most is when leaders come in and they have a particular practice. So what is a forward-facing practice within an organization we need to change, right? So what does that look like? What is
So in other words, they're a little bit more focused coming in.
Exceptionally focused, right?
Okay, so maybe that focus might be, for example, the achievement gap. We've got a gap between how our white students are performing versus our students of color, and we want to work with you on that issue, for example. That might be an area of focus.
Right, yeah. So the typical areas that we run into is overrepresentation in special education of Black and Brown students, right? Overuse of exclusionary discipline towards Black and Brown students. That means suspension from school. The achievement gap, of course, gaps in scores in math or reading or science. So all of these racial gaps that exist in sort of these areas within the schoolhouse, coming in very focused that this is a problem we want to address. We want to address this intractable problem that we've had for years, and we've been through a number of different often number of different consultants who just come in and talk at people. We work side by side on creating the sort of the adaptive mindsets around how we have to think differently, and then how that needs to translate into sustained action to change the culture and also tangible practices of folks within the organization.
And again, those leaders really play such a critical role, and also thinking about what is your sphere of influence, and the more focused you can be, the more likely around a particular item that you want to work on. And I'm assuming that you work on one item and then let's tackle something else. So maybe we want to tackle the achievement gap first, then let's talk about uneven discipline between white and Black and Brown students, for example, kind of one by one.
Right. So a particular practice, because if we spread it too thin, right? You try to tackle all practices at once to change within an organization. That's not orgs work. Orgs do not change, everything at once. I find it in our practice and also in through the research that organizations change very slowly. If we focus in on one practice, we can then practice and we can replicate that strategy with another practice. But also something else that drives sort of the inability of organizations to change is the leadership's constructed developmental lens of how they address the problem. So what Ron Heifetz says, he writes a book on adaptive leadership, is that the leader is also a very intricate part of the problem. So we often, I'm a former school leader, I like to see those in my organization like they're the problem, I have to fix them. And this is often how leaders come to us. Like, if I just fix them over there, things would be okay, without realizing that I am actually a part of the problem. And also not just a part of the problem, but probably a main driver of that problem because of the way in which I'm interfacing with it within my organization. So we work with the leaders' constructed developmental framing on how they need to see themselves as a part of the problem first. And changing their ways of being and knowing and doing is the biggest key to solve that problem that they previously saw out there, but as they soon learn that they are often a major driver of that problem.
So in 30 seconds or less, if you were to tell leaders, what are the top 3 things that you can do to begin to tackle this issue, to begin to build a more inclusive culture in a workplace, in a school, what would those 3 top takeaways be?
I think, everything. One, work with an expert. Most of us through our education, I have my doctorate. So at nowhere in time from undergrad to grad school to my doctorate did I have any sort of formal coursework or instruction on how to be a better leader for racial equity, right? I've developed my expertise in terms of my own reading, development, and practice, right? And so, also working with experts, right? I had several experts during my time as a leader that I work with to develop my lens and capability. So that's one, work with an expert. And 2 and 3 is one, it's 2 and 3. So number 2 is like, if you're going to make a move that you're going to implement to be more racially equitable, think about what's in it for either your kids if you're a school leader, or what's in it for your employees if you are like a leader of an organization. What is actually in it for them, and what is the impact on them? So we there's an intent that we want to be better, but what is the actual impact? And if there's an intended impact that you can identify, also develop metrics of success. How will we know it's actually being effective? So just by implementing a particular racially equitable practice that's intended to do well, we then need to also measure, does it actually have the impact, right? Work with an expert, make sure you're having a tangible outcome, and also measuring your impact.
So again, expert, what's in it for them, and then measuring along the way. Those are three excellent things for people to be focused on. So Tracey, can you tell us, and I know AJ has also put into the comments here about how people can stay in touch with you, but very quickly, how do people stay in touch with you?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at Dr. Tracey Benson. You can reach out to me on my website, Tracey, very easy, TraceyABenson.com. I'm on LinkedIn. I'm on Facebook. You know, we're any and everywhere. But if you just Google Tracey A. Benson, I'm one of the very few ones out there, so you can find me almost anywhere.
Awesome. Tracey, thank you so much for joining us. Coming up next month on December 15th is our next LinkedIn Live conversation with Jim Harder, Chief Scientist at Gallup. That's going to be on December 15th. Our newsletter is coming out tomorrow, and also just launched Manager Monday on LinkedIn. That comes out the second Monday of every month. Tracey, this has been an incredible conversation, a really eye-opening conversation, I think, for all of us, one that we need to be having much more of. And so I hope that this is the first of many more conversations that you and I have, and that also that those people who are listening now and will be listening in future, that they will look to you as that expert, that first tip that you gave in their work in building a more inclusive workplace or school or wherever they happen to work. So again, thank you so much, Tracey, and thanks to everybody who joined our conversation today. We'll see you next month.